In a moment, no one expected, and Buckingham Palace wasn't prepared for, Princess Beatrice stepped in front of the cameras and whispered words that sent a tremor through the monarchy. Her voice was steady, but her truth would soon reduce King Charles to tears. No royal correspondent was briefed. No courtiers accompanied her. There was no warning, no ceremonial flair, just a single podium, a dimly lit press room, and a princess who looked nothing like the dutiful niece the public thought they knew. For the first few seconds, the silence was unbearable. Then came her words, clipped but loaded, each syllable landing like thunder. "There's something I need to say about my uncle. About what he's never told you. About what was taken from him and from someone else." The air changed instantly. Cameras clicked in frantic bursts. Journalists glanced at one another, unsure if this was a joke, a publicity stunt, or a genuine act of rebellion. But there was no mistaking the gravity in Beatrice's tone. This wasn't a publicity ploy. This was a detonation. As reporters scrambled to make sense of her cryptic revelation, Beatrice refused to elaborate. She issued no formal statement. Instead, she offered only a riddle that sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. There's a hidden past buried beneath royal protocol, and it's time the past had a voice. Those words alone, spoken with such calm devastation, were enough to send palace staff into a tailspin. Within the hour, crisis teams were activated behind palace walls. Royal aides attempted to get ahead of the press, but there was no containing it. The monarchy's tightly controlled image had been breached by one of its own, and the damage was already spiraling. King Charles, who had just returned from a public appearance in Kent, was said to be visibly shaken when informed. According to an inside source, he locked himself in his private study and refused to speak to anyone except his personal secretary. Courtiers whispered of disorientation, even fear. Queen Camilla reportedly attempted to reach Beatrice but was shut out. Not even her own father, Prince Andrew, could get a response from her. The silence, combined with Beatrice's eerie composure, only made the situation more volatile. Outside the palace gates, the public reaction was instantaneous. Hashtags began trending within minutes. Speculation exploded. Was Charles hiding an affair? An illegitimate child? A royal crime? Or something even darker? The tabloids smelled blood. Rumors snowballed, each more outrageous than the last. But Buckingham Palace remained tight-lipped. Their only official response was a carefully worded, sterile line. "We do not comment on matters of a personal and private nature." That single sentence, intended to contain the fire, only poured petrol on it. The monarchy's silence screamed louder than any denial ever could. But what exactly did Beatrice know? And why was she the one to break the silence? The answer lies in a sealed family record hidden from the world for decades. Buried in the royal archives, Beatrice found a letter never meant to see the light of day. What she read not only changed how she viewed her uncle, it challenged everything we know about King Charles's origins. It began innocently enough. As part of her new royal duties, Princess Beatrice had taken on the patronage of a historical preservation initiative. She was touring the Windsor document vault, reviewing files for a proposed exhibition on the legacy of royal correspondence, when her fingers brushed a folder that didn't belong. Unlike the carefully catalogued files lining the shelves, this one bore no date, no seal, and no identifying stamp. It was labeled with just two chilling words: personal restricted. Curiosity wasn't supposed to be part of her role, but something about the folder wouldn't let her walk away. She opened it quietly, half expecting nothing more than a mundane personal note or misplaced condolence. Instead, she found a single, handwritten letter, aged, fragile, but undeniably powerful. The signature was missing, but the writer had signed off only as R. That single letter would haunt Beatrice for months to come. The tone of the letter was intimate, almost painful. The writer described a young man tormented by the weight of two worlds, his heart in one, his duty in another. The subject of the letter was unmistakably Charles, though never named outright. References to the pressure of being groomed for a throne, and those cold eyes watching his every move, painted a clear image. What struck Beatrice most wasn't the emotion in the letter, it was the chilling implication buried deep in its folds. "Our son," the letter read, "was born out of honor, not duty. I hope you will find the courage to acknowledge him someday, before it's too late." That single sentence shattered Beatrice's understanding of the family she thought she knew. A son? Born outside the palace walls? And more disturbingly, a deliberate effort to erase both mother and child from history? Beatrice didn't tell anyone. Not her mother, not her sister, not even Eugenie. She kept the letter hidden, revisiting it in the quiet hours of the night. She pored over its details, cross-referencing timelines, searching for clues in archived press clippings, estate guest logs, and private correspondence that had been sealed for decades. What she found in the months that followed would twist her stomach into knots and ignite a fire in her that couldn't be extinguished. She followed whispers of a relationship between Charles and a mysterious woman during his time in Scotland in the early 70s, a woman who abruptly vanished from public view with no explanation. But the most damning discovery was what wasn't there. No mention of this woman in any official documentation, no photographs, no engagement announcements, no polite dismissal as a youthful infatuation. It was as if someone had scrubbed her out of royal memory deliberately and with precision. And yet, the letter remained, a relic of a love story buried by power and fear. For Beatrice, it wasn't just about uncovering a hidden romance. It was about unearthing a truth that had been violently silenced. It was about a child who had lived in the shadows while the monarchy pretended he never existed. And the deeper she dug, the clearer it became King Charles was not the man the world believed him to be. Decades ago, a young Charles fell in love, not with Diana, not even with Camilla, but with a woman the crown would never approve of. And the consequences of that forbidden love still haunt him today. Before duty sealed his fate, and before the corridors of Buckingham grew cold with tradition, Charles tasted something rare: freedom. It happened in the early 1970s, far from the flashing cameras and choreographed smiles. During a quiet retreat in the Scottish Highlands, he met a woman whose presence disarmed him. Her name has since been scrubbed from official records, but her initial R remains etched in the letter Beatrice discovered. She wasn't royalty, nor a lady of court. She was the daughter of an artist, raised on bold ideals and unafraid of authority. A political activist in her early 20s, R had no interest in pomp, titles, or pageantry. That perhaps is what drew Charles to her so intensely. To her, he wasn't a prince. He was just a man. He laughed differently around her, spoke more freely, even questioned the life that had been laid out for him. Their bond, quiet and passionate, blossomed in secrecy. There were no security briefings or formal dinners, just handwritten notes, fleeting visits, and stolen time. For over 2 years, Charles maintained what palace aides would later describe as a high-risk liaison. It was off the books, off the grid, and dangerously off protocol. But for him, it was the first time he felt like he was writing his own story. R challenged him, softened him, and according to whispers Beatrice uncovered, even made him consider walking away from it all. But the House of Windsor does not allow freedom, and when rumors began to swirl, rumors of R's pregnancy, of whispered engagement talks, of Charles considering abdication of responsibility, those behind the crown acted swiftly. Royal aides intercepted letters. Security was increased. R was removed from every social invitation. When she resisted, pressure came from higher up. The final blow came quietly. Charles was sent abroad on an extended diplomatic tour. When he returned, R was gone. No explanation, no closure, just silence. Even her friends, those few who dared speak out, were met with palace denials and veiled threats. And in her place, the royal machinery resumed its course, steering Charles back toward duty and toward Camilla. Insiders later described Charles during that period as distant, mechanical, even numb. He fulfilled his royal obligations, but the light in him had dimmed. The man who once spoke of leaving it all behind for love now walked in quiet obedience. And for decades, the memory of R and whatever they may have created together was buried beneath medals, speeches, and royal tours. But what became of the woman who vanished, and the life she might have carried with her? What if there was another heir? One not raised in palaces or groomed for the crown, but hidden, silenced, and ultimately erased from the line of succession? For Princess Beatrice, the question stopped being hypothetical. The moment she stared at the final sentence in R's letter. Our son was born out of honor, not duty. Those words sent her down a path she couldn't retreat, from a path littered with redacted records, sealed files, and quiet warnings, but with persistence, and the weight of the truth pressing against her chest, she unearthed what generations had buried. His name was Julian, born in secrecy, hidden in bureaucracy, and adopted under a false surname that was carefully chosen to avoid any trace of the Windsor bloodline. Beatrice, driven by a storm of conviction and disbelief, tracked down the adoption records. It wasn't easy. The trail was cold, the details deliberately obscured, and every document seemed to vanish just as she got close. But then came a minor clerical error from an orphanage registry in 1974 that referenced an unusual donor family with anonymous but high-profile clearance. That was enough. She followed the paper trail to a quiet man living a quiet life, far from the palaces and privileges he never knew were meant to be his birthright. Julian. The name meant nothing to the monarchy, but it would soon mean everything. Before approaching him, Beatrice had DNA samples taken from old family heirlooms, letters from King George VI, hairbrushes passed down, and even one of Charles's handkerchiefs, retrieved from a sealed family gift box. She sent everything to a discreet lab overseas, avoiding any official UK involvement. The results were conclusive. Julian's DNA matched royal genetic markers with 99.8% certainty. He wasn't just a distant relation, he was Charles's biological son. The truth, cold and undeniable, shook Beatrice to her core. Still, she needed to see him face to face. Their meeting was arranged under the guise of a heritage project. When she looked into Julian's eyes, something hit her he didn't know. He had no idea the blood running through his veins once carried the weight of an empire. Julian was quiet, thoughtful, and deeply intelligent. A gifted academic, he'd battled depression, identity confusion, and a lifetime of feeling like a misfit in every room. He spoke of always sensing a presence missing in his life, like a ghost he could never name. He told her, almost without thinking, "Sometimes I dream of a man watching me from behind glass windows, like he's sorry." Beatrice wept when she heard that. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just heartbreak, wrapped in quiet recognition. This wasn't just a family scandal. This was a life stolen from its course. A man raised in shadows, while the truth sat untouched in palace drawers. Beatrice left the meeting shattered. She had spent a year uncovering the facts. But seeing the human cost of royal silence, of Charles's silence, made everything different. There was no way to bury this, no way to lock it back inside an archive. But revealing Julian's existence meant one thing: confronting King Charles with a truth he had tried so hard to forget. When Beatrice finally stood before Charles, holding the letter and the proof, the once unshakable king collapsed under the weight of his hidden truth. The confrontation was not scheduled, not planned, and certainly not approved by palace aides. She bypassed every level of protocol and walked directly into the private study at Windsor Castle, her hands trembling but her spirit unwavering. Charles looked up from his desk, startled by her presence. What he saw in her eyes was not defiance. It was heartbreak. And without a word, she placed 3 items before him: the letter from R, the DNA results confirming Julian's paternity, and a photograph of the son he never knew. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. His face, usually so composed, seemed to sink under the gravity of what lay in front of him. His hand reached slowly for the photo, and when his eyes met Julian's, something inside him gave way. "I was told they both were gone," he whispered. The weight of the lie that had shadowed him for decades came crashing down all at once. In that quiet room, stripped of thrones and ceremony, Charles broke. Tears welled in his eyes. Not the tears of a monarch, but of a man who had been robbed of his most human experience, a fatherhood he never knew, and a love that had been severed at its root. His voice cracked as he confessed to Beatrice what he had never told anyone. He hadn't walked away from R by choice. He was pushed, cornered by senior royals who believed her presence was a threat to the stability of the monarchy. Advisors fed him false information, that R had left the country on her own accord, that no child had been born, that silence was safer for everyone. "They told me there was nothing left to save," Charles said, almost pleading with himself more than with Beatrice. "So I obeyed." But it was the guilt, the soul, deep grief of a man who realized he had been living a life of public service built upon private loss that overwhelmed him. He clutched the letter like it could turn back time. The King of England was crying, not before cameras, not in the face of public duty, but behind closed doors, stripped bare by truth. He begged Beatrice not to go public. Not yet, not while everything felt so fragile. But Beatrice was done being silent. She had already made up her mind. She had seen Julian's pain. She had heard the truth echo in her uncle's voice. And she knew no matter the consequences, the world needed to know what the palace had buried. The palace thought they could control the narrative, but they hadn't counted on Beatrice's resolve, or the storm about to erupt. The palace went into lockdown mode. But no amount of PR spin could undo what Beatrice had set in motion, because the public wanted answers. and Charles couldn't hide any longer. The moment Beatrice stepped out of Windsor, having confronted the king with proof of his long-lost son, the machinery of the monarchy lurched into crisis mode. Doors were slammed shut, statements were drafted, torn up, and rewritten. Phones buzzed with code-red urgency. What had started as a personal reckoning was now a full-blown institutional emergency. The monarchy, already strained by years of scandals and waning public trust, found itself balancing on a razor's edge. Inside Buckingham Palace, fractures began to appear, some too deep to mend. Royal staff were split in fierce debate. Some stood quietly behind Beatrice, whispering that it was time the crown faced its truths. Others, more loyal to tradition than transparency, branded her a traitor. "She's throwing a match into a powder keg," one aide allegedly warned. The corridors were heavy with tension, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next leak, the next betrayal. And they didn't have to wait long. Within 48 hours, anonymous sources began to flood the press with chilling claims this wasn't the first time the palace had hidden an heir. Archived cover-ups, illegitimate whispers, silent payments. The walls of secrecy, once seen as royal strength, now looked like prison gates. Queen Camilla was reportedly livid. She told close friends that Beatrice wants to tear the family apart and accused her of reviving the ghosts Diana died trying to exorcise. Her fury wasn't just personal, it was protective. The institution she fought so hard to be accepted into was unraveling at the seams. Prince William and Harry were blindsided. Both received briefings, but neither could fathom the depth of the story until they were shown the photo of Julian. They held private meetings at Clarence House, trying to navigate a crisis that echoed too closely to their mother's torment. For William, it felt like history was repeating itself with a different woman pulling the truth into the light. To contain the fallout, Michigan 5 was allegedly brought in not to investigate Beatrice or Julian, but to assess how far the information had spread and whether any other documents connected to R or Julian remained in circulation. Security around the royal archives was tightened. Phones were seized. Computers were monitored. Staff who had been with the palace since the 70s were suddenly retired without warning. All of it screamed damage control, but it was too late. The fire was already burning. And as the world's eyes turned toward the royal gates, speculation exploded over one haunting question. Would Julian come forward? Would he show his face and confirm the rumors? Every tabloid, every news outlet, every whisper in Westminster revolved around this one possibility. But just when the crown was starting to regain control, Julian stepped forward, and what he said would shatter everything. He lived his life in the shadows, unaware of the power in his blood. Now, standing before the world with tears in his eyes, Julian reveals what it's like to grow up abandoned by a father who was born to rule. The interview was released without warning, no royal approval, and no media promotion. It appeared online through an independent journalist known for publishing the stories others were too afraid to touch. The setting was discreet, the backdrop plain, but Julian's words made it unforgettable. With a voice calm but trembling under years of emotional weight, he began, "I never wanted to be part of anything royal. I just wanted answers. I just wanted to know who I was." He spoke with a quiet intensity, reflecting on a childhood filled with questions that were never answered. "There was always something missing," he said. "It wasn't money. It wasn't status. It was belonging." Julian recounted moments that had haunted him for years. Strangers staring too long, whispers in public places. Even an envelope once slipped under his door that simply read, "Stop asking questions." At the time, he thought they were coincidences, paranoia. But after Beatrice showed him the letter, the proof, the picture of a young Charles beside a woman who looked like the sketches he used to draw in dreams, everything snapped into focus. As the interview unfolded, Julian shared the deepest corners of his past. He read aloud excerpts from journals he kept as a teenager, scribbled with thoughts of confusion, anger, and longing. "Why do I feel like I'm part of something I can't see?" one entry asked. Another, written at age 17, read, "Sometimes I think I was born for something important, and someone threw it all away before I had a chance to try." The pain in his voice was undeniable. And yet, what struck viewers most wasn't his bitterness, it was his grace. "I forgive Charles," he said quietly, "because I know now that he was lied to, just like me. But the people who built that system are the ones who decided I wasn't worth claiming. They're the ones I'll never forgive." Julian didn't ask for recognition. He didn't demand a title or a palace suite. His message was simple, clear. "I don't want a crown," he said, his voice cracking. "I just wanted a father." Those final words cut through the hearts of millions. In that moment, Julian wasn't a scandal, he was a son. A human being wrapped in a story that was never his to write. His courage, his vulnerability, and his refusal to be silent any longer sent a wave across the globe. The monarchy had survived crises before, but never a truth like this. The world was shaken, but nothing prepared anyone for what King Charles would do next. In a move that stunned his advisors and outraged traditionalists, King Charles walked into Westminster alone and made a vow no monarch had ever dared before. The atmosphere was dense with tension. No ceremonial guards, no pageantry, just a man with the weight of centuries pressing against his shoulders and the resolve of a father who could no longer ignore the cost of silence. Behind the closed doors of a special royal session, normally reserved for matters of constitutional gravity, Charles requested an unprecedented amendment. He asked that a private clause be inserted into his will, formally acknowledging Julian as his blood. It wasn't a claim of succession. It wasn't about inheritance. It was a gesture of truth, a whisper of justice against decades of orchestrated lies. But that wasn't all. Charles, moved by guilt and clarity in equal measure, announced the creation of a scholarship fund named after R, the woman the monarchy erased. It would support disadvantaged youth with extraordinary talent. Children like Julian who never had the privilege of knowing where they came from. The name of the fund was simple, The Forgotten Light. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the establishment. Many praised the king for his bravery. Others branded him a traitor to tradition. But Charles didn't flinch. He knew the ghosts he was unearthing could not be returned to the crypt of secrecy. Within hours, he delivered a rare public statement from the throne room, one that would go down in royal history. His voice, steadier than anyone expected, echoed through every household in Britain. The truth, he said, will no longer be buried in marble halls. It belongs to those we failed to protect, and it begins with the son I never knew I had. Those words cut through centuries of decorum. They shattered the illusion of perfection, but they also lit a path towards something more human, something real. Behind palace walls, however, chaos brewed. Senior royals urged retraction. They feared the precedent it would set, the questions it would provoke. Camilla, furious and humiliated, reportedly threatened to separate from Charles if he didn't reverse course. She viewed the move as self-sabotage, a betrayal of the institution she fought to join. Prince William was said to have met his father in private and pleaded, not out of malice, but out of fear. "You need to protect the crown," he told him. But Charles had made his decision, and this time, he wouldn't be ruled by fear, tradition, or obligation. For the first time in his reign, he was choosing truth over legacy. The kingdom held its breath. The media swarmed. Allies shifted. Enemies grew louder. But none of them could stop what had already begun. Because what Charles had unleashed wasn't just scandal, it was reckoning. And in that reckoning, the monarchy began to fracture from within, forcing every royal to ask themselves whether blood meant honor, or whether silence had always been their true inheritance. But the final twist would not come from Charles, Beatrice, or even Julian. It would come from someone no one saw coming. In the aftermath, a letter from Princess Diana, hidden in her private effects, surfaced. And within it, she revealed that she, too, knew the truth. It had been sealed away in a collection of personal writings, stored quietly in a family trust, untouched since her death. It wasn't addressed to anyone specific, but it was clear who it was meant for. Written in her unmistakable handwriting just weeks before that fateful car crash in Paris, the letter was more than a reflection. It was a warning, a prophecy, and a quiet act of courage. Its contents were raw, poetic, and laced with the kind of insight only Diana possessed. In it, she wrote of a boy who will someday rise without seeking the throne, a phrase that struck Beatrice like lightning when she read it for the first time. Diana spoke of a presence she had always sensed, a child born in silence, destined not for titles, but for truth. She went on to describe long-forgotten conversations with a woman she only referred to as R, conversations that took place in secret during the early 1990s. According to Diana, R had reached out in desperation, not for publicity, but for protection. And Diana, having endured the brutal machinery of the monarchy herself, listened. What Diana uncovered in those meetings was the story Charles had tried to forget. A love stolen, a child erased, and a man who never truly recovered. She didn't name Julian. She didn't have to. Her words were filled with the knowledge that someone had been cast aside not by accident, but by design. And more striking than anything was her quiet admiration for Beatrice. She sees things others hide. Diana wrote, "There's a gentleness in her that will one day be asked to carry a brutal truth, and when that day comes, I hope she chooses light." Beatrice, overwhelmed but resolute, read the letter aloud at a private gathering in Windsor. Only a few were present: Julian, quietly seated in the corner, tears rolling down his cheek, a handful of loyal aides, and those closest to Diana's memory. There were no cameras, no declarations, just words echoing through a room that had once silenced so many. And then came Diana's final line, one sentence that would linger long after the letter was folded shut. "If Charles ever breaks, let love not shame find him." At that moment, the room was still. No royal decree, no scandal, just truth, finally spoken by those who had carried it too long. Julian looked up not with anger, but with understanding. And in Beatrice's eyes, the future of the monarchy no longer looked like a crown. It looked like healing. Because at last, someone had dared to name the pain, not to weaponize it, but to honor it. As the monarchy grapples with the ghosts it tried to bury, a new chapter begins, one built not on illusion, but on painful, undeniable truth. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.